Korea, and also to fight against Koreans who were trying to promote reform in Korea. That was one group. There was another group of thinkers, people like Pa Geun-sik, inspired in part by Kang Youwei in China, about whom I'll talk in a minute. Pa Geun-sik felt that we needed a reform in Confucianism. He said, we have been following the wrong kind of Confucianism. We've been following the Confucianism of Juxi, which requires what? It requires a great deal of study of the classics, a great deal of self-cultivation, a great deal of reflection, and very little action. He said, no, that's why we're in trouble. What we need to do is follow the Wang Yang-ming school. Wang Yang-ming school thinks it's a direct connection between knowledge and action, the unity of knowledge and action. If we follow the Wang Yang-ming school, then we will become vigorous. We will be able to replicate the things that they have done in the West within the teachings of Confucianism. And Pa Geun-sik went on to say, 100 years from now, by the end of the 20th century, the whole world will be under one great Confucian order, Taedong or Datong in Chinese. Okay. And China. Well, again, China is sort of lagging behind a bit. After the stunning defeat to Japan in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895, people in China were saying, well, our old approach of just borrowing piecemeal from the West really doesn't work. We get Kang Youwei, who steps forth as an important reform Confucian thinker. And he sounds a lot of the themes which Pa Geun-sik said. And he attempted to push through an ambitious program of reforms within the framework of Confucianism. After 100 days, it was all over. And the Qing dynasty, and then even after the Qing dynasty was overthrown, on May 10th, Yuan Shikai, who then became the leader of China, attempted to make himself a new emperor. They kept returning to Confucianism as a way to buttress the state and to rationalize their position. So what we see, I think, during this first period of imperialism in East Asia, as far as Confucianism was concerned, is a great deal of unevenness. Things happened first in Japan, second in Korea, third in China. But we also see substantial differences in the ways in which people reacted to these things in the different countries. So I would say that the only way to really understand what is going on with Confucianism during this period of time is to deal with it in specific local context. Let me go to the second major turning point, and this is the decline of the West. As you all know, World War I, the Great War, was a horrendous experience. And peoples of the rest of the world were watching what was going on in Europe, and they thought, this is terrible. The bloodletting, the destruction. How could we think that the Western civilization was so superior when it can do this kind of thing? So they reacted negatively to the senseless slaughter, and intellectuals in the 1920s, in China, Japan, began to read the works of people like Spengler and Bergson, talking about the decline of the West. And so these people began to say, okay, maybe Confucianism wasn't so bad after all. And so you get resurrections of Confucianism at this time. Again, it happens first in Japan, I think, although perhaps you could say it happened at about the same time in China. A leading figure in this in Japan was an intellectual by the name of Inoue Tetsujiro. He'd actually been arguing for a revival or a resurrection of some Confucian values from earlier on, but his arguments gained a lot of steam after World War I. And his ideas and the ideas of other thinkers in Japan led to what became a kind of discourse on overcoming the West and overcoming modernity in Japan in the 1930s. And some of the arguments that came out of this time included the idea that the Japanese version of Confucianism is the pure essence of Eastern thought. And this is what we need to return to. China. In the 1920s, Liang Qichao, who had, of course, been a very important thinker in China from much earlier on, began to lay out very clearly his position that the West represents material civilization and the East represents spiritual civilization. And other Chinese thinkers like Zhang Junmei or Carson Chang, as he's known in English, pushed this a little further even. And he said, not only is the West the material culture and the East the spiritual culture, but in fact, spirituality should take preference over the Western material civilization, over Western-style science. And when Carson Chang or Zhang Junmei was talking about this kind of spirituality, what he was really talking about was Neo-Confucianism. He's trying to go back to the teachings of Zhu Xi. What about in Korea? Well, in Korea, there were still quite a few Confucian thinkers. One of the most important was a man named Chung In-bo. Chung In-bo was an adherent of the Wangyang Ming School in Korea. He was a man who went to China after Korea was annexed in 1910 and spent several years there before he came back to Korea. Then he got a position teaching at what later became Yonsei University in Seoul. And he's most famous for his line that Korean civilization, Korean national identity, is defined by a unique Korean spirit, which he defined the 5,000-year ul, or the 5,000-year spirit of Korea. So he was very much that kind of conservative right-wing thinker. But he spent a great deal of time trying to validate Confucianism. He went back into the Korean Confucian tradition, and he looked at various thinkers like Sung Ho, and he said, we can find in Sung Ho's work creativity, vitality, all of these things that are just as good as modern Western thought. And if we return to these traditions, we can strengthen ourselves and our society. There was also another interesting movement in Korea, and this was a kind of agrarian utopianism. And this really arose less among the intellectuals than it did among peasants and rural literati in Korea in the 1930s. They were reacting to increasing impoverishment of the countryside, and they blamed this on the penetration of the Korean rural economy by capitalism, by urban commercial interests. And so they began to argue that what we need to do is to reject capitalism, reject Western civilization, and create a rural utopia in Korea based on Confucian principles. Well, there were also countercurrents.